Welcome back to Kairos Conversations. Today we're going to be looking at the genealogy at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. We're used to seeing the connections between Jesus and the book of Genesis and John's Gospel, but Matthew does the same thing. So stay tuned and let's see. Welcome back here to Kairos Conversations. As always, I am Courtney Trotter, your Old Testament enthusiast and one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined today by my co-host Ryan Martin, our New Testament Greek guy. And we're going to be looking at the beginning of Matthew's Gospels and the genealogies. You've joined us here at Kairos Conversations, the place where if you want to discover the world of the Bible through the original languages, you found the right channel. All right, so Ryan, as we look at this genealogy, I feel like I need to just have some background. Like, what is the genealogy doing? Is it like 23andMe? Like, how does this relate to what my conception of a genealogy might be?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, the short answer is no. It is not like 23andMe. It is not like typing your granddad's name into Ancestry.com and kind of figuring out what kind of house your great-grandmother lived in or whatever. I don't know. It's something very different. Something, I guess we could start off by saying much less individual. Like 23andMe, right?
Right.
It's very much about me and my story. It's much more corporate. It's much more ethnic. It's much more like me and my people group. Like, how do we understand ourselves relative to our history? Right. Mm-hmm. It's a different goal. Like when you're reading this, when you're reading in Matthew, the beginning of Matthew, or in Luke 3, I think. You know, all the Toledotes and Genesis, all these genealogies in Genesis. It's just a different kind of thing. It's not about just getting our facts straight so we can know who Jesus's great granddad was. It's saying something. It's communicating something. With our genealogies, if I was going to write a family tree on a poster board, you know, which I've done that, right? I'm into that, as you might be.
Yeah.
But I'm not looking necessarily for big themes or trying to trace I'm not trying to communicate with something by the way I put it together. These genealogies are very much trying to do that. They're trying to tell a particular story. So if you ever hear people trying to discredit the New Testament or discredit the Gospels by saying hey, Matthew has this person as this guy's father, and Luke has this other person as this guy's father, look, Luke skipped a generation, or these kind of things. So look, it's not credible. It's dude, you don't understand how ancient genealogies work. That's not the goal here. The goal here is not to just give the most literal family tree type picture. The goal is to tell a story. And these authors are going to do that in different ways. Now, of course, most of what you see there is literally this person was this person's dad. That's there. This person married this person. That's there. But there's this bigger, more important thing going on of the story that's being told. So every time we see a genealogy, we're saying why? Why is this author putting this here, and what are they trying to communicate with it?
Yeah, that's really good to think about. The genealogies are their own genre of literature. You know, it's not like we all of a sudden, went from narrative to poetry to, oh, look, here's just a science chart of some kind. It is also trying to create its own emphasis, its own point, and it's there intentionally for a reason. All right, so what would be the overarching theme of Matthew's genealogy? What would be the point of it being included in there?
Yeah, it'd be a good thing to figure out, right? Since it's the very first thing in the gospel. Let's pull it up here so you can take a look. All right, and I've taken 17 verses and kind of collapsed them. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. On and on and on. Was the father of, all the way to Jesus, right? Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. So we go all the way from Abraham to Jesus. And why? Why are we doing that? Why are we doing that at the beginning of his gospel? Well, Jesus, who is the subject of this whole book, right? This whole gospel, right? He doesn't come out of nowhere. Right? A lot of times when you think about the gospel, when we think about what do we want to communicate about who Jesus is or what he's done, we start with, okay, there's this guy and he was God, and he died on the cross for our sins. And of course, all this is true. But none of the gospel writers start it that way, right? Everybody starts it off with Jesus being the part of a story. Jesus is the part of Israel's story. Jesus comes out of God's chosen people, and you need that in order for the whole thing to make sense. Just to highlight this point, Matthew uses a device that we call a chiasm, or a chiasm, where we have like a ABC, CBA. Like thing 1, thing 2, thing 3, and then thing 3, thing 2, thing 1. You can imagine this kind of shape that goes in and back out. I've highlighted for you there Jesus, David, and Abraham, kind of color-coded, so you can see this at the beginning and end. See Jesus, the son of David, son of Abraham, and then we go in reverse when we get to verse 17. From Abraham to David, 14 generations. From David to the exile, 14 generations, and from the exile to Christ, 14 generations. So we get this, like an inclusio. We get these words that are kind of getting this whole thing as one chunk. And who is both a part of this chunk and the climax of this chunk? It's Jesus, right? This whole story of Israel, in Matthew's mind, is holding together, reaching its climax in Jesus. And that's what he wants you to see before he launches into the story of Jesus' birth and his life and his ministry, his death, his resurrection, is that Jesus is the new and true Israel, right?
Yeah.
He is the truest and the climax of Israel's story, and he's using these kind of devices within the genre of genealogy to do that.
Yeah, I think like what you said is just so important that, Jesus is coming in the middle of a story here. And a lot of times we could almost like just open up to our New Testament and act like the rest of the story had not happened yet and preach the gospel that way. Whereas, as you look through the book of Acts, or even how Paul preaches the gospel, it's Christ died in accordance with the scripture, or, they're pointing back to the fact that he was David, or he fulfilled the Old Testament in a very particular way. So Matthew, especially with his emphasis of being a gospel directed to a Jewish audience, he's really trying to say like, hey, he is your Messiah, guys. He comes in your story. So I think that's really helpful to consider just the overall structure of that chiasm, like we were talking about, beginning and ending with Jesus and Abraham and David there in the middle. In what way is Genesis reflected in this, genealogy? Like I said, usually we look at John chapter 1 and we're like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, right? And we have that in the beginning to let me know that, hey, we're dealing with Genesis chapter 1. What way is Genesis in Matthew's gospel?
Yeah, nobody's going to read this in English and say like, oh, I see Genesis here, right? Mm-hmm. Except for maybe, if anything, we're starting with Abraham, right? It's not like Luke, whose genealogy goes all the way back to Adam. How is Genesis here? Well, when you see it in the Greek, it's actually kind of hard to miss. I'm going to pull up the English here with the Greek below it. Same beginning and ending here. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Then the ends. I've got a part of verse 17 there too, and this is all the generations. From Abraham to David were 14. Then from David to the exile. You know how it ends. But I've highlighted 3 words there, which in English aren't the same word at all. Genealogy, was the father of, it's one word in Greek. And then the word generations, like those words, not only do they not have anything to do with Genesis, but they don't have anything to do with each other. But when we look at them in Greek there, geneseos, egenesen, genei, they're all the same word, really. They're all gen word. They're all generation, begetting, genealogy. This is all kind of the same word group. So we see this same thing that happened. These are all the same word. Again, we don't see it in English, but genealogy was the father of, generation is all the same word. And not only are they all the same word as each other, but genesis, right? This is Genesis in the Septuagint, right? Yeah. We have good evidence that by this point, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the first book of Torah, of the Pentateuch, would have already had this title, Genesis, Genesis. It's that first word there. For those of you that have taken Greek with us, you see that eos ending for the genitive. You remember those, like in pistis or polis? This is of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. Your English translation could say of the Genesis of Jesus Christ, and that wouldn't be weird. It might sound weird in English, but that would be fair. because it is the same word, the book of the origin, of the beginning. Right? This is all the same kind of word in Greek.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, that's really that's neat to see there, and you can hear that gen, root in all of those words in Greek. But then again, we have all these nice English words that also have that same root, like genealogy and generation, that all talk about origins and people begatting people, as the Old Testament would like to say.
Yes.
So where do we see that Genesis language, like in the Septuagint? In the beginning of Genesis, the book of Genesis. So many Genesis.
Yes, too many Genesises.
Yes, Genesis.
This is Genese, if we make it plural in Greek, right? But I didn't know this, so I started researching for this episode. All right, I knew what I'd just shown you. That this is all the same word. It's the same as Genesis, but I didn't know that this book of the genealogy, like we see at the beginning of Matthew, that same phrase, Biblos Geneseos, book of the Genesis or book of the origin, that actually appears 2 times in the Septuagint, and only 2 times in the Septuagint, and never again in the New Testament. Once in Genesis 2 and once in Genesis 5. Right? These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. This is before the kind of the second creation story, before we have Adam and Eve, made out of dust, breathed into that narrative, which you probably know. And then again, in one of the Toledot, am I saying that right, Courtney?
Yes.
The book of generations of Adam. So the only other 2 times this phrase occurs is also in the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis. And yeah, like it's not a reach to say that a first century Jewish reader of Matthew's gospel would have been thinking, oh, Matthew's kind of placing Jesus in the Genesis narrative, right? It's a little bit different from John, where John is saying like, hey, Jesus is the actor in the Genesis narrative.
Yeah.
Matthew's more saying like this is the story that Jesus is coming out of. I think for Genesis, it's easy for us to like understand that this is the origin of the whole world, and that this is Creator God creating all things, of course. But we also want to recognize that Torah belongs to Israel, that this is Israel's telling of the story of the beginning of all things. So it's fitting that Matthew, the most Jewish of our evangelists, would start this way, placing Jesus within the Jewish telling of the creation of all things. Of course, he's making this point that Jesus is the son of Abraham, the true Israel, the son of David, the true Messiah. But that all of that goes back to the beginning and the way that that Israel's God, Yahweh, has been ordering history from the beginning. Yeah.
And I think it's like, when we think about those Toledotes that we were talking about, these are the generations of in Genesis. They come in sections, so just because you have that first verse there in chapter 2 or in chapter 5, it's introducing the entire section from the beginning of chapter 2 all the way to the end of chapter 4, and then from the beginning of chapter 5. I think the next one's in chapter 7. And so that whole section there, in the middle of that first Toledot, is the fall of Adam and Eve, right? In Genesis chapter 3, right there in the middle of Genesis 2, 3, and 4. And what you get there is what's often called the proto-evangelion, like the first gospel in Genesis 3:15, where it says, the seed of Eve will crush the head of the seed of the serpent, right? And he will bruise his heel and he will crush his head, right? And so kind of what you're looking for throughout the rest of the story is, who is the seed of Eve going to be? And so I think it's just really fitting that Matthew draws on this Biblos Geneseos language to say, hey, Jesus is the seed through which, the serpent will be crushed, right? So, like you said, John is emphasizing that he's the creator of the whole world, and Matthew is emphasizing that like he is the chosen seed, the promised seed from the very beginning.
Yes, and what better way than a genealogy to do that, right? And this is literally a list of who's the seed of who. So that makes perfect sense, and yeah, that's great. I'm so glad that you thought of that. That gives a lot of context. I mean, both that specifically and the big picture of the way that evangelion grows in that promise throughout the Old Testament of God's promise to bless the whole world through his chosen people. That's what Matthew's about to tell us. He's about to tell us how that happens, and that happens in Jesus.
So why else do you think there are all these like Genesis references?
Yes. I mean, I think we've already said this to some extent, and I want to summarize this by saying, like, this is the story out of which the gospel makes sense. Okay. I think one way that we can state the gospel is to say that the Messiah is the King of Kings, right? The Jewish king is the king and redeemer of all things, right? What a surprising turn, right? Well, that's where Matthew's going. Jesus, the son of 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 Abraham, right? Or I put David in there first, right?
Yeah.
The son of the son of David, the son of the son of the son of Abraham, right? Jesus is the fulfillment of all of this. This is the story that he runs out, that he grows out of, that he comes out of. He's the fulfillment of God's promise to bless all the nations through his people. And to vindicate that people, right? Jesus is Israel's vindication too. Now, it's not, we did a video a couple weeks ago about how this is not the vindication anybody expected, or at least that most people expected, right? It's an upside down kind of kingdom, but still, it is a kingdom, and Jesus will reign on the throne forever. Jesus is the true and better Israel, the true and better King of Israel and David. So I think that the main point here in putting this in kind of this kind of Israel story of the creation of all things is that Jesus is kind of the summation of that. As Israel, as creation's representative before God, the one who does that perfectly and fulfills that role.
Right.
And the other thing I would add, I mean, new creation is a theme, kind of new Genesis, new creation, even throughout the Old Testament. I mean, I'm thinking of the end of Isaiah here in particular, a new heavens and a new earth, right? That's the stage. That's what's at stake here, right? Why go back to Genesis when talking about Jesus? Because Jesus is kind of a new Genesis. He's the origin of a new thing. Right? If I can steal language from Bart, like a chandelier hanging in the air, it's both connected to this story, but it's also like held up by nothing. It comes in a new way. And I think Matthew and all the gospel writers are holding these things together as they tell the story of Jesus, both as the summation of Israel's story, but also a surprising new apocalyptic vision of who God is and how he interacts with the world.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Like you said, we can't really divorce Jesus from Israel's story, and he is, in fact, the true Israel, the culmination of all of Israel's journeying with God from the beginning, the very beginning, as we see there, that first Toledot, all the way to the very end, and the beginning and the summation of all things, which is some of that we get in Colossians, right? Some of that language there as well.
Oh, yeah. The creation hymn in Colossians, absolutely. There's so many great places in the New Testament that call our attention back to Creator God Christologically. And I think maybe the one in Colossians is very obvious. The one at the beginning of John is very obvious. And, you know, hey, let's add Matthew 1 to the list. Why not?
Why not? Yes. But like you said, that new creation theme is something that is very prominent in the Old Testament. You get in Isaiah, but it starts just there in Genesis with these Toledots that, like, after the flood with Noah, he's told to go and fill the earth and multiply it again, just like they were told in Genesis chapter 1. And you almost get this new creation moment with Abraham, that God's creating a whole new people when he calls Abraham out of his land. So that new creation theme is picked up early and often throughout the book of Genesis and throughout the Old Testament. And it's just continued again here, that Jesus is a new kind of Israel, creating a new kind of people in a new world, right?
Amen.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for walking us through that today. I know I had never made that connection with Genesis before today. So, I'll be happy to throw that one in my back pocket as I study along this Advent. And I hope everyone out there, you guys enjoyed it as well. If you like this kind of content, be sure to like, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube-y things. We have a brand new Patreon where you can get some cool stuff if you want to help support the work we're doing here at Kairos Conversations and Kairos Classroom. Like
show your mug.
One of these handy dandy mugs. So feel free to go and check us out on Patreon and support us if you would like. But as always, we hope that the Lord blesses you and keeps you until we see you again next time at Kairos Conversations.